very warm welcome to you all. The participants of this session are Mr. Zafar Hilali, Ashraf Qazi, and Mr. Hussein Haroon. This session is being moderated by Omayr, Aziz, Saiyid. The total duration of the session is 60 minutes. We would appreciate it if complete silence is observed while the session is in progress. A question and answer session will be held at the end. Please raise your hands and the mic will be brought to you. Please keep your questions short and precise and refrain from making a statement. Thank you. I will introduce you to our moderator, who is Mr. Omayr Aziz Sayyid. He is a political analyst with an interest in Pakistani politics and national security affairs. He studied political science at Pitzer College, California, and business management at the College of Business Management in Karachi. He has a career in the corporate and private business sector. He manages a school and with an enrollment of over 2,000 students. So over to you, Mr. Omayr.
Thank you. Just a brief introduction. This is going to last 60 minutes, and I'll request our panelists each to present a 10-minute opening statement, after which we will have a group discussion for another 20 minutes, and we try to keep at least 10 to 15 minutes for audience question and answers. Now, a brief introduction to our panelists. We have Mr. Ashraf Qazi, who's a senior retired diplomat and foreign service professional who hails from Balochistan province. Amongst his various assignments, Mr. Qazi has been Pakistan's High Commissioner to India, Ambassador to USA, China, Russia, and has also served in East Germany and Syria. In 2004, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon appointed Mr. Qazi as Special Representative of the Secretary General in charge of the UN Assistance Mission in Iraq. In 2007, he became the Special UN Representative in Sudan, and from 2011, he has held the position of Director General of Institute of Strategic Studies in Islamabad. We also have with us Mr. Hussein Haroon, another esteemed diplomat who was Pakistan's ambassador to the United Nations from September 2008 to December 2012. A scion of the Haroon family, he is a businessman, social activist, and a former Sindh Assembly Speaker who is a board member of various educational institutes, sports associations, and charity organizations. He began his public service career as election coordinator for the Pakistan Muslim League in 1970. And he has also served as delegate to the UN General Assembly and as member of the Board of Governors of IBA. And we have Mr. Zafar Hilali, who has become well known not just as a senior diplomat, but as a political analyst and commentator on current affairs, especially concerning international issues. He holds a LLB from King's College London, and he joined the civil service of Pakistan and then the Foreign Service in 66-67, and has held various appointments such as Special Secretary, Foreign Affairs to the Prime Minister, Additional Foreign Secretary, and has served in missions in Sweden, Czechoslovakia, Washington, D.C., and the UN, and has been ambassador to Yemen, Nigeria, and Italy. He regularly contributes to print as well as print media and participates in talk shows. So our topic for today is Pakistan's geostrategic environment. Pakistan is a very, troubled country. We face various challenges in both in economic policy, its institutional development, interrupted experience with democracy, as well as being a very strategically important country on the outskirts of the Soviet Empire first, then as a frontline state in the war on terror, and its current state as a intermediary between the warring factions in Afghanistan and the US, and its important role it plays in the region. So given its strategic importance, as well as its various challenges it faces, the geopolitical environment is a very important issue and affects the whole country more than perhaps a lot of countries which are not so strategically importantly located. So therefore, I will hand the mic to Mr. Zafar Hilali and request him to make an opening statement before we move to the other panelists.
If it appears that I'm reading, it's because I am. And I am because I think it keeps me focused to read what I want to say rather than to and who and are. No man or nation can wear one face for himself and another for the world, because where we stand in the view of others is determined to some extent by where we stand in our own eyes. Viewed thus, let's admit that the distance between the government and the people, the rulers and the ruled, is now central to any understanding of Pakistan. Sadly, though, we have reached a pass where, if we happen to prosper, it's in spite of our leaders and not because of them. A sense of community and of the common weal is sadly non-existent in Pakistan today. The lack of national identity and underdeveloped sense and feeling of nationhood and of low self-esteem has many causes. The weakness of state institution is one. The overriding power and influence of family-based political parties which demand a loyalty over and above that accorded to the state is another. But a blocked political system which is incapable of change is the central reason for our failure. It's a pity that at a time when we need to stand together, Pakistan is so divided. In the international arena, a global rebalancing of power is underway. This has to do with China's rise, the economic shift from the West to the East, and the US pivot to Asia. The US preference for diplomacy over conflict in the greater Middle East, Washington's desire to retain bases and forces in Afghanistan, the interim agreement with Iran, the nuclear agreement with India, and the reassertion of power by Japan and South Korea. Pakistan's external environment too has changed. There is the US-India strategic relationship, the US-Afghanistan strategic agreement, and the US-Afghan bilateral treaty currently under negotiation. There is also the India-Afghanistan strategic agreement and the evolving US-Iran relationship that has far-reaching implications for the region and for us. All of which means Pakistan can no longer bank on separate and exclusive bilateral relationship with neighbors like the US and the Shah of Iran. Instead, it has to have, like the Shah of Iran in China and like the US, which is not our neighbor. Instead, it has to have a foreign policy that takes into account the linkages that have sprung up around it. In other words, we require a foreign policy and we will have to take hard decisions based on hard decisions. Well, let's begin. To begin with, we must view the Taliban for what they really are. A war society whose existence depends on war. They exist only through combat and confrontation with the enemy. If there is no enemy, they are unable to accept the feeling of existing because they are congenitally unable to mix with the rest of society. In other words, they are unable to belong to any community except the company of fellow fanatics who only have their hate for the rest of us in common. The notion that they are our misguided brothers and that all conflicts can be settled by negotiation and compromise is fatuous. But muddle-headed Muslims like us can't get their heads around this simple fact. As a result, the world's seventh nuclear power is in the throes of a nervous breakdown. its political leaders are so overwrought and befuddled that one of them was unable to distinguish between a saint and a sinner. We must recognize the Taliban ideology poses as much of an ideological threat to Pakistan as their militias pose an existential threat to the country. We only sided with these mad, nihilistic, apocalyptic gangsters because the forge had taken a shine to them. Actually, since 1994 till a couple of years ago, when the worm finally turned, our Afghan policy was our India policy in another guise. We needed mercenaries to do our bidding against India in Kashmir and elsewhere, much like the Indians used the TTP and Baloch secessionists to destabilize Pakistan. Befriending the Taliban to do our dirty work was considered prudent policy because although an alliance with the devil seldom is. It's much too late to fiddle around with the Taliban's genetic code. However, no elaborate rewiring is required to persuade decent Pakistanis that unless these psychopaths are stopped, the collective punishment we all will have to bear will be more than what we can withstand. With regard to India, America seems determined to build up India as a nuclear power. The military implications of this are a cause for great concern for Pakistan. US-India military cooperation threatens to upset the strategic stability in the India-Pakistan nuclear and conventional arms equation. Pakistan's nuclear deterrence may lose credibility after India acquires anti-ballistic missiles from the US, Israel, and Russia to reinforce its second strike capability. Let's not forget, India already possesses a nuclear triad. India knows it can drive a hard bargain with Pakistan today because we have never been weaker or more disunited, the military more distracted and preoccupied, or Pakistan more unpopular internationally. Hence, predictably, India is acting up, dismissing Nawaz's pleas for a result-oriented dialogue. Is India getting ready for a decisive move on Pakistan? Consider. The Indo-US Strategic Alliance is the new world version of the old Cold War Indo-Soviet Treaty, which by neutralizing Chinese support for Pakistan virtually guaranteed the outbreak of the Indo-Pakistan War and its successful conclusion by India. India's present-day war doctrines are based on the assumption that nuclear weapons will not be used in a short, intense, India-provoked conventional war on Pakistan. And any threat of them being used by Pakistan will be neutralized by India's American alliance and the UN acting under US pressure, much as was done in the case of chemical weapons in Syria. So if the nuclear shield Pakistan developed and which helped it to offset India's conventional superiority is not there any longer, we will be back to square one, looking for another weapon that is immune to Indian countermeasures. I am one of those who believe that US-Pakistan interests are in conflict and not in harmony. The two countries stand on opposite sides of the fence. Their enemies are different. Their thoughts and plans for the region are poles apart. The roles they envisage for each other are in stark contrast. Their position on controversial matters of international law and current world issues, such as Palestine, Kashmir, Iran, nuclear disarmament, etc., are different, if not completely at odds. American goodwill for Pakistan, though important, is no longer essential. The nuclear shield helps Pakistan to deter India still, and hence generate a sense of confidence within the country. It has ended Pakistan's perennial need for allies like America to offset India's conventional military superiority. It still does, for the moment at least. Nevertheless, Pakistan cannot throw caution to the winds and risk a rupture in a relationship that is still important, which is still in important respects in the interests of Pakistan. It is therefore a good sign that though we have been talking with the Americans under the same roof for a long time, but for the first time, as Sultan Aziz's visit showed, there seems a meeting of minds is possible. For example, in the awareness that peace in Afghanistan only stands a chance if it is underpinned by both the US and Pakistan. Hence, an effort should be made to continue on this track. An unrestrained rift between the US and Pakistan would be a multi-dimensional disaster. So what of the future? And I conclude. Let's just say, with leaders with the cranium capacity of Zardari, Nawaz Sharif and Imran Khan, even a wild optimist won't be joyful at the prospect before us. I won't go as far as to say the future shows we have no future, because that's not absolutely certain, and after all, there is nothing that a miracle cannot fix. However, what I will say is that the future appears infinitely more threatening than inviting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hilali. A rather sobering assessment of our environment. Mr. Qazi, could you give us your thoughts?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. Chairman, my dear colleagues, Zafar and Hussain, my dear colleagues, Zafar and Hussain, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi
Wa alaikum salam.
wa barakatuh. Unfortunately, I am not in a position to counter what Zafar has said. I believe that we are today at such a situation where instead of trying to suggest I have the answers to the kind of problems we face, I would like to just throw out some questions for you to consider and not necessarily answer today, but to ponder over, because it is this kind of exercise that is required for us to develop any response to the situation we face. We must ask whether a systemic, dysfunctional government, or a government that is systemically dysfunctional, and a governance which can provide no protections or public goods, from such a government and governance, can we develop any coherent national policy, including foreign policy? Is it meaningful in any sense to discuss in detail any aspect of foreign policy without first addressing the dysfunctional state of affairs at home and state failure which is staring us in the eye? Without addressing that, how can we can have an intellectual exchange, but how can we translate that into practice? How are we going to face the potentially lethal, fatal challenges of tomorrow under a leadership, and I'm not referring to just one government, but successive governments, that simply refuse to address the awesome range of challenges that we face today? And Zafar referred to the Taliban, and we read every day about the latest developments in the farce that is known as negotiations with the TTP. It is a farce because it is designed to go nowhere, and it is designed to deceive the public that there is a policy in play, whereas in fact there appears to be neither a negotiation policy in existence nor a military option that is available to us and that is acceptable to those who will have to implement that policy. Is it in any way useful to address the political leadership, which is completely aware of the problem and politically determined to do nothing about it? I'd written a piece the other day in which I quoted Noam Chomsky and his remark that he disagreed with I think it was the biblical saying, or somewhere else, where people were enjoined to speak truth to power. And he said, no. There's no point speaking truth to the powerful. They already know the truth, and they're very comfortable with the truth. You need to speak truth to each other so that you begin to realize the potential you actually have. And then you might begin to do something about that potential and begin to develop policies on it. With regard to specifics, India. Our overall objective has got to be a transformational objective. It's got to be to get out of the present mess and to leave something behind for the next generation, who in turn will be enabled to leave something behind which is better for their successors. We need to grow at 6% just to sort of provide jobs to those coming on the market. And we need to grow at a much higher percent in order to be able to provide productive jobs in a technologically sophisticated global economy where skill sets of a high order are required. Look at our education system. Does it even begin to address, leave alone answer, this particular challenge? When it comes to Kashmir, rhetorically we keep talking and reiterating our position, and our position just happens to be legally, morally, politically right. But have we developed a policy that actually protects Kashmiri rights while we champion their political rights? Or have we followed policies that have actually had the impact or effect of exacerbating their human rights, so that today, arguably, the human rights situation in the valley is just about close to being the worst in the world? And we can easily blame India, and very cogent arguments can be disposed. But what role have we played in lessening that impact and all? Whereas we've had a political and moral obligation to do so, and we are mandated by the UN resolutions to do so. Would work towards improving relations with India and making some progress towards developing a predictable relationship with India, including economic cooperation, would that be the condition for any future progress on the subject of Kashmir? Or would it be an impediment, as we sometimes suggest without any evidence, that unless the Kashmir issue is solved, we cannot do this and that with India? Does that help the Kashmiris? Does that help us with our need to develop transformational growth? Or is it a rhetorical position which corrupt and soft politicians use in order not to face tough questions or to do risky things? With Afghanistan, what do we have to do in order to gain the trust of the Afghan people, including the Pashtuns of the Afghan, who said, don't trust us? There was a period when every Afghan, being whether Pashtun or non-Pashtun, said we owe a debt of gratitude to the people of Pakistan because of what you did for us during the time of the Soviet occupation. Today that doesn't exist. There's absolute deep mistrust of Pakistan because of the short-sighted policies we've adopted. Can we succeed in our policy objectives towards Afghanistan without regaining that trust and confidence of the Afghan people? Can we keep India out of Afghanistan by forfeiting the trust of the Afghan people? And as Zafar hinted, coming across to the Afghans as the Indians seem to come across to us, big brother bullies, hegemonists, do we achieve anything by coming across similarly to the Afghans in that fashion? There are many specifics where they are in the wrong and we are in the right, but the overall atmosphere is such that they look upon us as looking upon them as smaller brothers who should adjust to the realities in Pakistan, even if it's inconvenient for them? Can you develop a stable relationship with Afghanistan on that basis? And given what the scenario might be after the so-called drawdown, first it was withdrawal, now it's drawdown of the American forces in Afghanistan and the build-up of the ENA, and you want to avoid a two-front situation, India on one side, Afghanistan on the other side, they're very friendly with each other, and you messing around with both for no particular profit to yourself. Do we want to avoid that situation, or do we want to exacerbate that situation? With the United States, yes, the United States policies are what they are, and they're very bad, very short-sighted, they're arrogant, and Iraq and Afghanistan have shown that they don't even pay dividends. But us entering into the blame game or pretending to be extraordinarily critical of the U.S., whereas our entire elite and leadership are thoroughly dependent on the United States, are the people of Pakistan deceived by that? If you look at the American market, our students, our exports, our assistance, an angry and U.S. can impose costs of a very high order on Pakistan. Have we developed the resilience to deal with that? Is it necessary for us to deal with that? Are we developing an image of ourselves and maximizing our options vis-a-vis the states and other countries such that our voice will be heard with greater effect in international capitals, including Washington? Or we just indulge in these rhetorical games of criticism in order once again to fool our people? We don't like the United States and we're a big nuisance to them, whereas we are thoroughly dependent on them. Our revenues don't even cover our consumer expenditures. So what about every single aspect of human resource development and development expenditures? Every bit of it either comes from the printing press, which is a criminal tax on the poor, or it comes from external aid. And we talk about sovereignty and self-respect. And we say we are very smart because we fooled the people. There's this fiery speech we've given, which everybody is reading. China.
Qazi Sahab, we are running out of time. If I'd ask you to just wrap up.
I think that's the kind of questions that I think need to be asked. And do we have the leadership that can provide the answer? Do we have civil society can provide the answer? Do we have a younger generation coming up that will provide the answer? Will our masses be organized and mobilized in order to bring about those changes which our elite have deliberately avoided and actually have made every effort to ensure that those changes are never brought about? Can such a Pakistan begin to address its own future? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Qazi. Mr. Hussein Haroon, could you give us your comments in 10 minutes, please?
My distinguished colleagues on the dais and many others sitting in the audience, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon. The geopolitical equation for Pakistan, well, as my earlier colleagues have pointed out, anything that deals with the weaknesses of the nation will define your geopolitical equation, and your strengths will be able to dominate or persevere, whichever the case may be. But to begin with, you have to understand that all the weaknesses they pointed out, and so many more that they have not even referred to because of time and various other reasons, those are what define and dictate your geopolitical situation. No mighty, strong nation is going to have to worry about its geopolitical situation. They can only improve it or better it. Then we come to the point, Pakistan's standing in the world. Again, dictated by your internal strengths or weaknesses. There are extraneous other aspects which will also define and dictate towards it. But certainly, you will have to have it within you. The fire must be within your belly if you want to achieve progress and go forth. If it's a lot of cold ashes, well, you're not going to get anywhere with it. Without being denigrating in any way to people who put together a fabulous foreign office and a tremendous policy with relevance in the world, or the then known world, which basically was the West, not even the East, we managed to come into our own, doing all the right things, making all the right moves internationally to make ourselves feel proud that we were a definitive cog in the entire machine called the foreign equation in and around Pakistan. But the reality of the matter is, if you sort of decide it in very simplistic terms, one, in the first 30 years, we started off as very definitely highly committed to the United Kingdom and its policies. Ergo, we felt the impact and consequences of the Suez Canal and its aftermath. Thereafter, we sort of took on the American CETO and CENTO positions, and initially, of course, there was the boom, the economic windfall. You had the Korean army fallout, weaponry that came towards you, and so much more. And those are gung-ho days. And then, of course, we had to suffer the 65 war and the fallout of Tashkent. We then suffered the 71 war and the loss of East Pakistan. And then we suffered supporting all the cavalierly aspects of American foreign policy with Wilson, Charlie Wilson, and of course we paid the heavy price of the disintegration of any form of society in Afghanistan, in our neighborhood, and various other aspects also came into play. But interestingly, the first 30 years, and I'm sorry, there was an omission, in the Islamic bent, which came in post-1973, whereupon we started pursuing not a South Asian policy, but a Middle Eastern policy, where we decided that we were going to be highly Islamic in every way of our life. Where that has got us, other than a very large panhandle, I'm not completely sure. And we always like to speak of how friends come in our to help us and to alleviate everything that we undergo. But I think that if not what we achieved, certainly the Muslim world lost most of its leadership, its strong leadership that had built over years, and subsequent to it, we got the sort of leadership that allowed subjugation, and the Muslim world at least sort of lost weight and shrunk from being the OIC to the Arab world, and now it's shrunk to the Gulf states, and everything that is acceptable decides the size of how the Islamic world will be treated and looked upon. After 77, roughly, till today, we've had the next 35 odd years as held completely enchanted. Shall I call it enchantment by the Afghan nation and its worries? Whether it is due to American largesse, whether it was due to Russian largesse, whether it's due to now Indian ambitions, the Afghan policy really dictated what we're all about. So, from being British, shall we say, surrogates, to American surrogates, to Islamic surrogates, and now Afghan surrogates. Even the AFPAC policy is called AF first, because we are second in the whole process. So, the geopolitical equation as we dictated it has been to be good followers. And we were the proverbial knife in India's side with the Americans, and it suited the Americans. And when they achieved what they wanted, we became the Chinese knife in the Indian side. And I presume that's where we're going to be for some time. We're at this great position. Let me, shall we say, misquote Shakespeare. For Pakistan, the great question is to be or not to be. To be what or not to be what, don't ask. But to be or not to be, that is the question. We have to decide where we want to be at. So far, I have not really, and as I said, this is not in denigration to any of the great people that have created, conducted, or worked in the foreign policy of Pakistan, but it's a simple question that as we look forward, we have to, as our colleagues have said, build upon our strengths, or build our strengths, and then work upon it internationally. We have tended a very weary and potholed existence so far, but there is light across the skies. Things can change, provided we take unto ourselves an understanding of what we wish to be, where we wish to be, and how long is it going to take us to get there. In terms of what the world looks at you as, what is your position? I think in the traditional allies, we seem to have lost severely, whether it be with our old friends Iran and Indonesia, whether it be with our 65 friends, whether it be with our other friends like China, Japan, Korea, in the Far East, whether our equations remain the same in most of Europe. I don't think so. I think we have lost considerably our standing in every place in the world, and whether we like it or not, we get tarnished by being told, well, we don't believe in what you're saying, prove it to us what you're saying, blah, 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 blah. There is a general disbelief about Pakistan. This is, of course, a lot to do with our internal extremism policies. It has a lot to do with governments that change willfully, and it also is something to do with our Indian policies, which always have been, in any case, so lopsided that we're either all for them or not for them at all. And the world doesn't understand inconsistencies, and they tend to believe inconsistencies only from those who have the wherewithal to be able to understand their position and can be inconsistent.
Could I just ask you to wrap up here, so move to the next stage?
I think that fairly sums up what my belief is in the two aspects that have been put before you. I'm sure we'll have questions to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Haroon. Just to take from Mr. Haroon's point, just wanted to pose, you made a point about Pakistan's, question being to be or not to be. That's a very frequently discussed question in the international media about whether Pakistan, is really going to survive. Are we actually going to be able to deal with the challenges at the scale of the challenges that we are facing, both in terms of security and terrorism and war, and also economy, just creating jobs and dealing with the water shortages. So could I ask Mr. Hilali to comment on, take the discussion forward on that?
I'm not a soothsayer, so I don't know whether Pakistan will survive or not. It all depends on its reactions to certain situations. But you have, if I may, take the liberty. When I was working for Benazir, the point of having someone working with her on foreign policy was to advise her. So I used to give a lot of advice, solicited and unsolicited. But I thought I would read to you, because it is now, that was in April 1996, and this is now whatever it is. I thought I would just read to you very briefly what I told her in a note, which I have. I said, our credentials in Afghanistan are badly tarnished. Even if we profess no favorites, the fact is that today we face a greater threat from across the porous border with Afghanistan than from the well-guarded frontier with India. In Afghanistan today, Islamic bigots brought up in the belief that God and time are on their side are sharpening their sword to inflict their credo on us. It is a credo which treats man distinct from woman, confuses bigotry with religion, and debases the message and allure of Islam. Were the Taliban to triumph in Afghanistan and spread out, every shred of hope for those who want to create within Pakistan a modern, moderate state would be lost. It is fortunate that they are not in control of Kabul, despite our best efforts on their behalf. That was before they took Kabul. Surely, then in another note, 4 days later, surely the more broad-based the government in Kabul, the greater the chances of peace returning to Afghanistan and friendly relations with Pakistan. Why prop up the Taliban? What does a Taliban dispensation promise for Afghanistan except chaos and the spread of antediluvian ideas? After 3 notes in the same vein, this is what she wrote in her own hand. And I repeat. Let the Afghans sort themselves out. I do not believe we should interfere in Afghanistan. If Dostum joins Rabbani, the Kabul regime will be more pro-Pakistan. Whether he does or not depends on him, and we should leave it to him to decide. Our trying to artificially bolster up the Taliban by tying up Dostum's hands will only prolong the Afghan misery. The Taliban have brought the present situation upon themselves. All these refusals come despite our political advice. As you sow, so shall you reap. If the Taliban get isolated, they have no one to blame but themselves. The dust seems to be settling in Afghanistan, and we should allow it to settle naturally. There is nothing we can do about the Iranian friends being mother's little helper in Kabul. That's an expression which mothers will understand. Irrespective, let the Afghans sort out the Afghans. Our policy is that there should be no outside interference, and that policy should be maintained. We claim we have no favorites to anyone who will listen. Let us live up to our words. Benazir Bhutto, 29 May 1996.
Thank you, Mr. Hilaly.
Guess what happened? On the next meeting, which I also happened to be present, a general, then 2-star, later 4-star, thumped the table in joy and announced, "Gentlemen, we have Kabul, and now for Central Asia." See, that's the kind of mindset that lady had to confront, and I'm sure others will bear that.
Mr. Qazi, would you like to
in less than a minute. You asked what is the future. The future, let's take 2050. You're going to have a population of around 350 million. You right now have 50% people at a primary level in getting education. Maybe it's gone up a little, but that was 25% at the middle, 5% at the higher. How will you produce jobs that are going to produce stability and are going to provide productive employment to the youth who otherwise will go into other things? It's the black economy, the informal economy, and the Baradari system which is really sort of stabilizing us. But our fragile food security, which still exists, it won't last for long in view of the population. So if you project yourself on the basis of the present to 2050, this is a totally non-viable country. So we are assuming fundamental changes over a whole range of national endeavors, the signs of which should be apparent now if they're going to deliver results by 2050. There are no signs of it, and the chances of it happening by 2050 are, unless some technological apparition or miracle happens whereby we can do things or borrow from the rest of the world, which are totally inconceivable today. In time they'll happen and all. We are facing, to put it very mildly, a very bleak future if we have one.
Yes, I think the water shortage. So we'll come to the questions in another 5 to 10 minutes. Just wanted to pose any further comments. I just wanted to raise a point raised by Mr. Hilaly, if any of you would like to point out that, obviously we've suffered a lot as a result of our interference in Afghanistan. And there seems to be some kind of a pullback or realization of the mistakes you've made. And you also mentioned that we've given up on
there is one
history,
constant in Pakistani politics. We never learn from our mistakes. So the appearance of learning from our mistakes or turning over a new leaf, and you keep hearing about this. GHQ today is not the same as the one before, and it's turned over a new leaf. But the fact of the matter is that conditions are brought about whereby the people are delighted whenever the military intervenes. Kisi ne kaha hai ki Pakistan's politics begin from ABC and always end up at GHQ before the second round of ABC sort of begins, which then it finally ends up at GHQ again. So that they come in unwillingly, but then they go out unwillingly too 10 years later, leaving the country in arguably a worse position than in which they found it.
Let me just add to that. Absolutely true. The other thing that we know is that somehow we don't expect to pay consequences for our mistakes. Galti ho gayi, let's move on. No, sorry. That's not how it happens. You made a serious mistake. You pay. And then move on, if possible. We forget about that.
But provided you realize the mistake. I mean, have we actually realized the mistake, or are we, as you mentioned, that we still face severe challenges from India? Or is it still being used, the jihadi industry, as a ultimate?
We don't learn. And therefore, whatever advice or whatever questions we put should never be to the government of the day. Because the government of the day, as Noam Chomsky said, knows the answers better than you do and is much more comfortable than you are with the situation. They are far more wealthy, they are happy, and you are looked upon, the people in general, as a loser, and they are saying naffal all the time because they are winners and all. That's their attitude, and so if you want to keep addressing and sending little memos to them, you're welcome to do that. It's not going to happen.
Yes, Mr. Haroon.
A very poignant moment has come upon us. We are once again unsure whether we ought to be a strong central state, as some of the points that are emerging before us are unfolding, or are we going to be the original federating states where who decides what comes from below? And this question is becoming very important and is taking Pakistan towards uncharted waters again. There is a strong feeling that the budgets now should 75% remain within the provinces. There's a strong feeling now that the 18th Amendment was tailored down in the middle of the night to what it is today, neither fish nor fowl. And the net result is there are so many grey areas where things cannot be decided that is going to create much more problematic than it was originally. But there is also a very clear movement by the provinces to deal internationally on their own and decide what their wherewithal is coming from. Under those circumstances, I think we also have to pick up the point whereupon, where are we heading? And shouldn't we decide this matter once and for all, rather than once again try to fritter away at the edges? And I believe that unless we decide which way are we going to create the social contract, we have a very difficult time ahead.
Yes. I think we have another 15 minutes left. So can we open for the public? Do we have a mic up there? Miss.
My name is Muinuddin. Professionally, I am advocate. Sir, my question is, I want to ask you a question from Zafar Hilali Sahab, that the national question is not the part of the Geo equation in Pakistan, and why do you ignore it? Please, what's your comment? Thank you very much.
Could you repeat the question a little slowly, please?
I want to ask you, sir, question is that please, national question in Pakistani state, oppressive nations we can call it, that it's not part of the geopolitics. Why do you ignore it? You are talking about the Afghan issues, Kashmir issues, external issues. Why do you not consider about the internal issues? It's my question. Thank you very much.
If you're saying that we are talking more about something that is less relevant, that is, we should discuss internal policy more than external policy, perhaps you're right. But I thought that this is about where we stand in the world, this particular session. But I agree. I think internal policy is much more important, and it is that will determine our fate, not what are really the kind of relations we have with distant countries or even the United States. It's how we are at home.
And I think Mr. Haroon addressed that in his comment about strength being an important determinant of your policy. Can we have the next question in the front row? Gentleman on the left.
Najmuddin. Mic de de.
Mic no, so the whole audience can hear you.
One of my first thoughts as I heard our panelists was, oh, what a difference retirement makes. It does, and I'm exactly the same boat. But
turn it on.
Really, what I wanted to suggest was that what I gathered from the panelists was, right now what Zafar said was somewhat different. But what I gathered was, give foreign policy a rest, focus on the real problem, which is internal. And incidentally, I think what we should point out is that as we resolve our internal problems, we'll resolve the most nettlesome of our external problems. Today, you are in a position where the world will heave a sigh of relief if you focus internally and will give you whatever assistance you need. Let us dispense with conspiracy theories and focus on the fact that there is genuine concern. And that concern can become sympathy if you start tackling your internal problems as you should. Whether it is the question of the 18th Amendment, but more importantly, whether it is the question of contending with extremism, contending with what we are faced with internally in economic terms, in terms of population growth. If we start tackling these problems, you will have both the world's sympathy and the world's assistance. So, in the geopolitical equation, let us think not in terms of geopolitical, think in terms of geoeconomic. We have a geoeconomic location. Let us utilize that to help in resolving part of our economic problems if we can. Thank you.
Well said, sir.
Can I just answer that?
Let me just... Okay, one sec. I think the burden of the questions that I asked was that external affairs can hardly be addressed unless we sort of address our internal problems, and you've elaborated upon that. The question then arises that who's going to do it? The people whose responsibility it is, they have made quite clear that they have the legitimacy through elections and they are simply not going to deliver. That is absolutely clear. And the assumption behind it is that you have a captive electorate because of historical, sociological, other reasons, structural reasons, whatever. Now, can you address that situation? Certainly the government has no interest in it and will oppose every attempt to do so and have vast machinery, publicity, the media, the lot. So what about civil society? What about the next generation in terms of organizing the masses, in terms of informing them? We had a politician who gave the promise of doing such a thing, but it seems to have lost a little steam.
You know, I would love to agree with what Mr. Najmuddin has said. Actually, I'm dying to agree with him, but I can't. Because it's very simple. They won't let you fix the problems at home before their agenda kicks in. Please understand that also. Yeah, I'm sorry, I would love that. If you can get me a guarantee from India that, my God, we won't interfere in Pakistan's internal relations, we won't put pressure on him, we won't plant, we won't have contrived incidents on the line of control and this and that, and we will let you deal with your problems on your own. I agree with you, nothing could be better. But they won't, and I don't blame them. There's the cow belt. I mean, I don't know if you people have seen the Indian television, but there's these anchors, they like to assassinate us. I mean, it's the kangaroo courts that come out, and these are the most popular Indian channels. And the way they go for us, the way they go for their own government, for not maximizing our difficulties. So, I think that whereas we want the space, and perhaps, this policy of saying, please come, Mr. Manmohan Singh, come, beg you to come, we beg you to come, and he says, well, I don't know, to see, rather than all that, if it works, I don't care. I forget about my pride. I'm prepared to rub that into the ground, but I don't think it works. I don't think that's the India we know professionally.
I would just add to what Zafar has said, that let us make the assumption that India is hostile and unfriendly. India doesn't want to see a really successful Pakistan. Some go even much further, what India's up. The fact is that we do none of these things towards India, particularly the normalization policy, which I say we need in our interest, out of any kind of love for India or any... We do it because it's sufficient in terms of our own national transformation interests. We do it because, like the Chinese, said they need a peaceful neighborhood in order to realize their domestic objectives, set in 1979, which they have magnificently overachieved. Why can't we take a leaf out of their book and have working, predictable relations with all our neighbors despite serious problems which are not going to be resolved for a very long time to come, and what we can work towards is the alleviation of the human rights of the Kashmiri people without shamelessly giving in on our principled positions as was done by President Musharraf.
Well, how about alleviating the rights of the Pakistani people? You see, the question is, if anyone sees a weakness, they're going to step on you, whether you like it or not. And if you think you can work in exclusion, that is not possible. You have competed previously on all levels, and for a long time you have been successful as well. It's not just totally all failures. And perhaps at a time when we had the upper hand in certain ways, economically and otherwise, we wouldn't deal with them the same way they don't want to deal with us now. So it goes both ways. I think the thing is, if the physician heals himself and tries to bring about the strengths where you can compete and take on. I mean, today while you're talking here of the problems exacerbated by Indian policy, you have people going from our senior largest province in this country and doing trade deals across in corridors, and there speaking about various requirements to bring people together. Now, if this is national policy, it must be exercised all sides. It must be universal. But when that doesn't happen, then when your strongest factor is dealing with people while you say, this is not fair to us, I don't think we have a coherent foreign policy anymore, or a neighborly policy.
I think that we are out of time now. But thank you very much, Mr. Hilali, Mr. Qazi, Mr. Haroon. We need to move on to the next session. And thank you very much, audience, for coming.